Hey everybody, so this is Hannibal again. Sorry for the long hiatus between this video and the previous one. I have been in the deep dark hole of paper writing here at Berkeley. I'm hoping to get two things published. So I haven't been able to produce any videos in the last few weeks, but here's the next one. So this is going to be the video 3, hopefully of 5. So the previous video, the first video talked about the project that I'm doing, the fresco documentation project. The second video talked about the history of this area that I'm interested in. And this video is going to talk about the religion and artistic traditions of these areas that I'm interested in. So as we, so first we should ask the question, what was the religion of these people? So I'm going out there to collect these frescoes. What religion do these frescoes belong to? So there's various ways to answer that question. You could say, okay, what are the ritual practices that were associated with this? What was the doctrinal name of this, what these people worshipped? But to me, it seems like the easiest way to answer that question, at least in the case of temple iconographies, is just to say, what gods did these people worship? I mean, what was their conception of the divine, essentially? And so for these people out there in the North Chinese villages, it was a lot like ancient Greece. So you had a giant pantheon of gods, some of which were quite important, some of which were not important at all, some of which were worshipped in a particular place. There were stories associated with all of these gods. They had relationships with each other. So, sometimes they could even fight with each other. And and then you also had, of course, philosophical traditions that went along with this, as you did in ancient Greece. So you might, both worship Zeus and be a Platonist or something, whereas in China you would, worship the Jade Emperor and also sort of subscribe to Confucian ideas or the, philosophical tenets of Buddhism or something like that. But the best source for the pantheon of the North Chinese villages is, as before this guy Willem Groters, who was out doing surveys of villages in this area in the 1940s. And so Groters was surveying a number of areas, but they're all fairly similar, and we can aggregate his data together. And the important thing to understand about Groters is that Groters was a missionary, and his basic thesis in life was that sort of Chinese religion doesn't have content. The only way to understand Chinese religion is sort of to think about it as a form of linguistics, as dialectology, actually, where you go around and you basically all Chinese gods are kind of the same. You just count how many of them there are, what are the different ways of depicting them, how do those different traits flow over space, and you've got kind of a dialectology of Chinese religion. And this was his great idea in life, basically, which is a really interesting idea. But and so to that end, when Groters went around counting gods, he didn't talk about what did the god mean or anything like that. He was simply counting how many units of worship, or what he called a cultic unit. So in any given village, and one village in this area would have, let's say, between 4 to 10 temples, how many units of worship of any given god were there? And he compiled these huge lists of how many gods there were. So I've stuck all of his, he did 3 different counties, I've stuck them all together. But I'm just going to go through and talk about the pantheon. What were the main gods? What did they do? How many of them were there? So Groters described the iconographies. Many of these are very common gods. You can find them elsewhere in China, but I've been trying to collect. One of my main goals with this project has been and will be, when I go back, to collect extant iconographies of as many of these gods as I can, because they're actually extremely rare now. I mean, Groters would go, saw him with his own eyes hundreds and hundreds of iconographies for these gods, and now, there's, for any given god, if it's well attested, there might be 30. Left in all of, Shanxi and Hebei provinces, which is where I work, extant iconographies. So, I'm trying to collect what are the extant iconographies of any of these from before the Cultural Revolution. So let's just go through the list here and try to talk about what are these gods. So the most popular god by number of cultic units, 202 cultic units out of the 200 and something villages that Groters surveyed, is the Dragon Kings. And there's a lot of different types of Dragon Kings. There's Black Dragon Kings, White Dragon Kings, the 8 Dragon Kings. But they're basically all the same. So Dragon Kings are weather gods. They live either on the tops of mountains, and you still have, to this day, you have sort of temple hermitages, Taoist temple hermitages on mountaintops where they worship the Dragon Kings, and they do rituals to send them out to give rain to the world. They also live in pools, so you would have Dragon King temples by pools of water. And the Dragon Kings are weather deities, so they fly out around the world. They give you water. And actually, interestingly, the center of the Dragon King cult is actually not a Dragon King, but this figure called the Mother of Water, the Shremu, who is the mother of the Dragon Kings of the different seas, and she's the one who controls the whole process. So interestingly, it's actually a female-headed cult when you really look at the iconography. The second most common god by just by number of units is the god of the five ways. So the god of the five ways is actually this little crossroads spirit. So in terms of resources that go into this cult, it's not that important, but there's certainly a lot of these temples where you build a little shrine at the crossroads, and the god of the five ways, it goes out and it captures evil demons, which might be traveling on the roads, and B, it guides the souls of the dead. So when you die and your soul is floating around, the god of the five ways will tell it which way to go to get to the afterlife. So the next most popular god by numbers of units is 155 units that Hrothgar saw, is Avalokiteshvara, or in Chinese Guanyin, who is the Taoist god of compassion. So she, if you have some, if you have some, problem, you're in danger in some way, you say the Guanyin's prayer, and she'll come down from heaven and she'll send you relief. It's also kind of a god in these villages. It's sort of a god associated with women, associated with childbirth, etc., etc. It's also, as we've seen, a god associated with the direction south. After that, the god, next most important god after that is the Horse King in terms of number of units. I actually don't think the Horse King is a very important deity in this area. It's just that in the regions that Hrothgar surveyed, and not in my regions, the Horse King was an attendant of the Dragon Kings and was depicted in his iconography. So because there's a lot of Dragon King temples, therefore there's a lot of Horse King temples. But the Horse King, it's originally an Indian god, Hayagriva, and it has sort of vaguely tantric associations. In these villages, it's a tantric god, which also just helps you with your horses. So if your horse or your mule or your, some kind of important livestock got sick, you would worship the Horse King and it would come help you. After that, there's Lord Guangguang, or Guan Yu, they might better known as Guan Yu, who is a famous figure. He's often called the Chinese god of war, and he figures in the famous Chinese novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. He's a martial god. He defeats enemies. There's all sorts of stories about him, which every Chinese person knows. He's martial strength and loyalty, all these good things which are associated with him. After that, at number 6 in Hrothgar's list, but I think this is actually the most important god in the village, is the Perfected Warrior, who has 104 units. But in terms of the resources spent on the Perfected Warrior cult, I think this is actually the most important god. So it's always built on these huge towers at the northern end of the fort. And in terms of his iconography, the Perfected Warrior is he's always clothed in black. He has long hair, which hangs over his shoulders. He carries a blue sword. He's barefoot, and he's surrounded by a group of generals, thunder generals. They're called the Thunder Department often in the texts associated with him, who go out and conquer his enemies. And actually, if you look at texts from the 16th century, it's often said that he's considered to be the god of soldiers, and he seems to have been worshipped by the village defense militias, which originally created these fortresses in the 16th century. So he seems to be, and he's also associated with the direction north. So he's the god of the north. He's the god of the northern dipper, and he's the god who will protect you from Mongol attack. After that, in Hrothgar's lists is the river god. This absolutely doesn't exist in the areas where I was surveying, which are right next to Hrothgar's areas. I'm not sure why. I've never seen this cult. But it seems to have had something to do with irrigation and may have been related to the Dragon Kings. Beyond that, you have the three officials, which have 70 units. This is a trio of bureaucratic Taoist deities who govern heaven, earth, and water. After that, you have the Buddha. So again, Hrothgar's is just aggregating numbers. So you could have a giant Buddhist monastery where they're, practicing meditation and reading thousands of year old Buddhist texts from India, and they have a image there that they call the Buddha. So okay, that's the Buddha. Or you might have a little village shrine where there's just this kind of nebulous spirit that they call the Buddha, and that's as far as Hrothgar's counting goes, that's the same thing. But anyways, we know what the Buddha is. After that, you have the barbarian god, the Hushan, and there's various explanations for what this god might mean. It seems the name might originally not be Chinese. But there's, again, this doesn't exist in my areas. It did exist and still does exist in the areas that Hotel surveys. And there's a whole series of cultic sites associated with this guy, usually in big temples up north of where I was working before. But hopefully I'll be able to find some intact iconographies of this, because it does seem to have been common in other areas. Beyond that, you have Wenchang, who's usually thought to be the god of literature. In this area, Wenchang is always placed on a very tall tower. And he's associated with another one that we'll come to in a bit called the Kuei star, the Kuei-sing. But anyways, he's the god of literature. He also has astrological connotations. He's seen to be this very, kind of well-dressed official mounted on a horse. After that, you have what's either called the ladies, the nyang-nyang, or the grandmother, the nai-nai. And these names switch back and forth. But this is this sort of maternal Taoist gods, and there's actually several ladies or grandmothers that exist. But usually what they're involved with is childbirth. So if you are a woman and you want to get pregnant, you can go worship to the nyang-nyang, or if you they'll come to women during childbirth and help them. They also help with other types of bodily ailments. There's a nyang-nyang who helps with eyesight, interestingly, and other things like that. Interestingly, these are quite powerful female gods. So the main nyang-nyang, who's the goddess of purple mist, she's called Bixia Yuanjun, has a whole enlightenment story where she is modeled on the life of the Buddha. She leaves her family, she goes to meditate, she achieves enlightenment on a mountain. She's given by the Jade Emperor kind of a position in the Taoist hierarchy. Beyond that, you have the Kuei star we already talked about. It's associated with the cult of Wenchang. It's this strange astrological demon. I don't really know much about it other than what it looks like. Beyond that, you have Kshetagarbha, who's in Chinese Dizang, the earth store, who's a Buddhist figure who's associated with the souls of the dead after they've gone, and it's usually associated in practice with the cult of the 10 Yama kings, who are the kind of gods who judge you after you've gone into the underworld. Beyond that, you have the god of the soil, which is not as common as it is in other parts of China. It's sort of a well-known Chinese god, but here it's actually not very common. But usually it would, if you were going to dig into the ground, if you were going to dig a foundation or dig a new irrigation ditch, you had to propitiate the god of that particular chunk of soil first to make sure it didn't hurt you. But beyond this, there's a whole bunch of gods which are, weren't particularly common, and I have not been able to find any extant iconographies. So you have the Great Saint, which seems to be the local name for sort of fox spirit cults. Then you have the fire god. You have the god of wealth, who you pray to if you wanted to get rich. You have the general enlightenment Buddha, which was sort of this millenarian cult, which was actually quite new in Roter's time, but was active in the areas that he was working in. Now you have Falun Gong in these areas. So then you have the Dark Altar, who seems to be associated with the cult of the perfected warrior, but it's also a cult which prevents against rain. I'm sorry, not rain, hail. You have the King of Vermin. You have the spiritual official. You have Maitreya, who's the future Buddha, the Buddha who will come at the end of the world. And it's also the really fat, happy Buddha with the big stomach that you rub. I don't really know which type of Maitreya Roter was talking about. You have the mountain gods, and you do have some depictions of these in other iconographies. These are usually these little old men with these long white beards and a staff who, they'll bring you medicinal plants, or if your livestock get lost in the mountains, they'll find them. You have the three youths, Sanlang. I don't know what that is. According to Roters, it was the cult of a particular mountain in his areas. You have the three emperors worshipping three historical Taoist, quasi-historical Taoist figures. You have the god of walls and moats, which is a city god not present in the villages. You have the king of the hearth, which was actually a very common god, but it was worshipped only inside the house. At the hearth. And it would sort of report on your doings to the higher ups and the heavenly bureaucracy. So you had to be very careful around the king of the hearth. But there's not many extant examples in terms of painted iconographies anymore. You had Bodhidharma, who is the founder of Zen Buddhism, this famous figure. There's lots of stories about him. You have the three teachings, which are these wonderful sort of ecumenical temples where you have the founder of the three great Chinese religions, so Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, and Laozi, who is the founder of Taoism, all lined up in a row, and you can worship which one you like, or all three of them at once. You have Weitua, which I think is just Vajra, that is kind of a Buddhist protector god. You have the god of disease. Again, a lot of these little ones I really don't know about. I'm just guessing from the names. You have the god of disease, the god of the 5 grains, the god of the 3 purities, the god of the 3 stars, the god of green shoots, the god of eye glow, which is actually, as I said, one of the ladies, the Nyang or the grandmothers who I assume can help you if you have eye problems. The god of millet, the granary official, who's a god of grain stores, interestingly. You have the ox king, which seems to show up in these strange tantric situations. I would be really interested to find more about that particular figure, actually. You have the god of happiness, you have the god of wine, you have Laozi, the founder of Taoism, you have the god of wind, you have the god of the northern peak, which is a particular large mountain, which is a holy mountain. It's kind of the northern March Mount of the 4 Chinese holy mountains. It's actually not that far from this area. And then you have Lord Tan, who is a early Ming, I think 15th century general who became worshipped. And so statistically speaking, so these are all the cults that Hrothers was able to find out about. I've certainly been able to find out about much less because since the Cultural Revolution, all of the very uncommon small cults have disappeared totally, and now only a few of the large ones survive. So I'm just going to leave it there for the moment, and so this has been a really quick summary of the village Pantheon, based almost entirely on Hrothers. So in the next video, I'll start to talk about so what are the main iconographic types, and how do these images actually function within village religion, and hopefully we'll get to look at more of the pretty pictures, which is what I'm in this for. So as always, thank you very much for listening. If you did not come here through my GoFundMe page, I have a GoFundMe page. I'm raising money to go back to North China and do more documentary work on these pictures because a lot of them are being destroyed. So you can check it out at gofundme.com/North Chinese Frescoes. And as always, I hope you enjoyed it and have a good night. Thanks for listening.